Hi everyone, hope you guys are all having a great day today. In today's video, I'm going to cover the whole entire market in terms of Dow Jones, Nasdaq, and S&P 500, including the economic calendar. Now, I do post these videos daily, so I highly encourage you to double check the latest video on my channel. It's how I get the most up-to-date information. And if you want to be notified when I do upload them, consider following and subscribing so you can be notified when I do upload them. Now, before I get to the analysis portion, I'm going to go over the economic calendar. And for Tuesday, September 10th, 2024 at 6 a.m., we have NFIB optimism index. And then one thing to note for the following trading day on the Wednesday, we have CPI inflation numbers. And then the trading day after that on the Thursday, we have PPI inflation numbers. This could play a role basically on the FOMC interest rate decision meeting on the Wednesday, September 18th. Mind you, that is the week after this week. And basically, they're deciding on either 25 or 50 basis points for the most part, I would say. It's not guaranteed. But from what Jerome Powell stated last time in his last speech was that most likely it's going to be 25 basis points in terms of rate cuts. And if this inflation numbers comes in better than expected, there's a chance that we might get the 50 basis points. And again, those FOMC interest rate decision comes out at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. And at 2:30 p.m., Fed Jerome Powell has a press conference. Now, if we get to the analysis portion, overall, in my opinion, we're going to see somewhat of a pullback, potentially correction zone, because if you look at the 1 year, 5 year, and the all chart for the MACD line, indicating if we're in a bearish or bullish movement, in case you're new to the channel. For the 1 year chart right now, we're looking at for the Dow Jones, it's still in the bearish movement, indicating potentially further downside. The 5 year chart potentially going to cross over to the downside. Now, I will say it is a little bit arching to the upside. You could argue that we're at levels to bounce up to the upside. But again, because of the market somewhat baking in 25 basis points already, I don't expect much upside unless the Fed decides to do 50 basis points rate cuts. Then we could see momentum to the upside. In terms of tech sector, you could argue that we're already at low levels, for example, Nvidia and Tesla, that maybe they're primed to bounce to the upside, pulling the market to the upside. That is a potential. But again, the indications are still pointing to the downside for the most part. Not necessarily meaning that we won't have updates, like I said in the last video. We will have like essentially dead cat bounce days. So for example, today we did go up, but I think the overall market still is to the downside for the time being. Again, overall long-term markets do go up, right? So 1 year chart, again, downside, 5 year chart potentially coming down. And then the all chart, it has not crossed down, but it's potentially arching down, potentially. And we have hit the all-time highs. So if you go, again, this is the Dow Jones, mind you, closed at 40,829 points. We are at the all-time highs. And then if I zoom into a 3-month chart, previously in July of 2024, that was the all-time high. And then we did come and test it in August and September timeframe, and then did pass them, but then got pulled down. And then now for the S&P 500, I'm going to be looking at ETF SPY, again, ETF for the S&P 500, same thing, just different ratio. And mind you, all-time high, so on and so forth, same thing basically. And you go to the 3-month chart for a sec, just to show you, July time frame created all-time highs, and then in August and September, basically tried to test it a bunch of times and got pulled down and did not pass the zone. Essentially, the Dow Jones did a better job in terms of passing it and then got pulled down. And then the 1 year chart, MACD line showing downside bearish movement, 5 year chart, downside showing bearish movement, stronger than the Dow Jones in essence. And then the alt chart, you could argue maybe in the same zone or somewhat a little bit stronger than the Dow Jones to the downside potentially. Now again, can we get pulled up? We could potentially reverse the upside and dismiss all these MACD lines. But I would say that would more take of the Fed deciding to cut rate cuts by 50 basis points versus the 25 instead, that the market pretty much baked in already. And then in the tech sector, you would argue that has already pretty much not necessarily bottomed out, but has gone down enough where now we're going to see more upside. And then that way, because they're mega cap stocks, again, for like example, Nvidia, $3 trillion company for the most part, Tesla, it's pretty much, it is a mega cap stock, but pretty high up there, and it could be primed to go to the upside. We do have sales numbers coming in probably in a month from now, give or take, and so on and so forth. So again, those could be good catalysts to the upside potentially. I will say the volatility index is quite low right now. It's at 19.46 points and has gone down 13% today. Again, that is more for the upside to getting pulled up. So potentially we could be going up. But again, indications for the most part, like I said in the last video, is overall for the most part to the downside, pullback / potential correction, and we will see dead cat bounce days, like for example, like we did see today. And I'm going to show some levels to show that we were primed to potentially bounce, which I did mention in the last video, I believe, pretty sure I did. And And then we are levels to get pulled back down to, which I'll show soon as well. So now going to look at a Nasdaq ETF QQQ, which is the exact same thing. It's just different ratio in terms of ETF versus the actual Nasdaq. And we are not necessarily the exact same play as the S&P and Dow Jones, but pretty close. We are near the all-time highs, like I showed last time. And here was the all-time highs back in July 2024. But we have this upward trend resistance line, which I should show for the S&P in case you're new to the channel. So for the S&P, by the way, mind you, again, this is SPY ETF for the S&P 500, and we have an upward trend resistance line dating back since 2010. Went up to it multiple times, then got pulled down to this upward trend support level, and then we have pretty much a major crash one, but we only have 2 touch points, so not sure if it'll hold true for sure. But we are within the zone mid-range, and we've seen a couple times being in the mid-range, we will kind of fall back down to the support level. And will that happen? I personally don't think so. I don't think the pullback would be that crazy or / correction because we're in an election year, but that is always a possibility to come back down to this upward trend support level potentially. But yeah, just show for that. Now, if you QQQ ETF for Nasdaq, same thing, upward trend resistance line dating back since 2010. Mind you, we did break through it in 2020 to 22. And then just one thing to note, this does not mean that the markets are not going up. The markets are still going up within this upward trend resistance line. It's just that when it goes up to it, it gets knocked down. But overall, the market goes up for the long term. Like in essence, the markets always tend to go up anyway, regardless, for the longer term, right? Bigger picture kind of thing. But either way, so we basically came back underneath it. And then let me get closer to the 3-month chart. We went up to it, let me go to 1-year chart actually. Went up to it again, or went underneath it again, and then tested it. It got knocked down and then broke through. So this was the July time frame. I know there's too many lines. It's just because when I'm trading, I use a bunch of lines right about here. So we broke through it and then came back underneath it. And then this is the line, just so hopefully now it's easier to see. Upward trend resistance line dating back since 2010. So almost same thing in terms of the play, because this was in August and September. So same thing with the S&P and Dow Jones. We tested a major level. So for the S&P and Dow Jones was more of the all-time high level. And then for the Nasdaq, it's more of the 2010 level, and then got knocked down and been heading down ever since. And then if you look at the 1-year chart, bearish movement still for the MAC line, 5-year chart, bearish movement still. And then for the all chart, I think it's closer to getting pulled down to the downward trend resistance line. And you could argue we have a lot more room to the downside to go if you were expecting to hit this upward trend support level that we've seen. Sometimes some pretty crazy drops right about here, crazy drop right about here, so on and so forth, to the downward trend, upward trend support level, right? Now, again, I don't expect that to happen just because it is an election year, and that'd be pretty dramatic for an election year, in my opinion. But either way, we do have some pull to the downside. Now, in terms of levels of support, or not necessarily levels of support, but I would say levels that we bounced off of, and you could see why we kind of bounced off it is, for example, SPY ETF for S&P 500. Mind you, closed at $546 some change. Around the zone right about here, we have bounced off a couple times. So 1, 2, maybe 3, you could argue right there because there's 2 touch points, and then 4, 5 somewhat, but multiple times bounced up or bounced off this level, give or take, and went up to this zone, which we've seen multiple times, gone up to the zone right about here horizontally, and then pretty much could get pulled down. Again, it's pretty dramatic. It looks like within like probably 4 or 5 trading days, went up to the zone, multiple tests, and then came back down to the zone. So not necessarily get pulled down to the same zone, which is about 538 and some change. I'm not saying that necessarily is going to happen or anything, but I'm just saying that you could see it again like we've seen multiple times in the past. Again, overall trajectory is, in my opinion, still to the downside with dead cat bounce days, like up days overall. It's not going to be just straight down days. But you could see why we bounced off this zone, give or take. And then for the Nasdaq, same thing, bounced off this zone, give or take, which is more of a resistance zone, in my opinion, as opposed to a support level. And then there is a channel of resistance and support bouncing off back and forth. If we were within this zone, I would argue maybe we could see a reversal to the upside. We've seen multiple times support and bounce up to the upside, and then it came down to this level right about here again. So if we were at that level and bouncing up to the upside, plus if we saw Fed cutting 50 basis points versus the 25 basis points, plus given the tech sectors, not tech sector, but the mega cap stocks, you could argue maybe we could see to upside. I would see more of a reason maybe we're actually going to upside, but right now I don't think we hit a critical level to fully bounce up to the upside, with the MAC line showing more downside, and so on and so forth. And then for the Dow Jones is more of the moving average and plus cluster of downward trend support level potentially. It was more of a resistance, but it was potentially support. An upward trend resistance level dating back since 2021. You could argue that was still more of a resistance versus support. So maybe we just bounce off moving average going to upside, maybe. But again, I'm expecting more downside in my opinion with dead cat bounce days and so on and so forth. But again, this is always just my opinion, so please do your own due diligence and research before buying and selling. And that's basically it. If you found this video beneficial, consider dropping a like. It does help the channel, so thank you so much for that. I do appreciate it. And again, if you want to be notified when I do upload my next video, consider following and subscribing so you can be notified when I do. And thanks again for watching. Appreciate it. Take care. God bless and peace.